What can change the nature of a
Role-playing game. Let's be honest, the 5th edition of Dungeons & Dragons hasn't been that impressive a year after launch. Many of the old complaints about 2014 persist in the game, and the release schedule hasn't been particularly exciting. The issues with front-loaded classes, the almost obsessive urge to represent each new ability with a spell instead of an innovative mechanic, classes that rely on a single crutch ability that they are built around, and the unbalanced mess that is multiclassing is commonly brought up when people ask about the new system. For all the players who love Crunch, it hasn't been an exciting new version. But those who love fluff, it's been a difficult few years. But fortunately, Wizards of the Coast can still turn things around if they just look at what worked for Dungeons & Dragons in the past. And I'm here to remind them. They won't listen, but maybe the people that count will. And that would be you, the players. People complained for a decade about how D&D never got the setting books right. The Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide was a meme. It was so incomplete. New Ravenloft took one of the best-written settings, dumped most of the lore, modified existing characters unnecessarily for modern audiences, and then axed most of the horror themes. Gabriel backed me up on that one. Spelljammer is possibly one of the worst supplements ever written for D&D, and I've got well-read copies of The Endless Stare and the DM's Survival Guide. Planescape skimmed over what made that setting special, and then missed the point entirely. Then they forgot to add the epic quests that defined Dragonlance, but they remembered to add orcs and werewolves. Only Eberron stayed close to its roots, and that's because the lead designer was still heavily involved. WOTC has the rights for some of the best fantasy settings ever made for role-playing games, but they can't grasp the concepts that made them the legends that they're remembered as. Even Spelljammer, which the original writers will admit was not a good idea at the time, is still fondly remembered despite its flawed debut. Planescape drowned you in lore. It was the setting that not only made you ask questions, but it made you question your beliefs. The fact that Torment is one of the greatest computer RPGs ever written doesn't hurt its reputation. Forgotten Realms has the lion's share of products, and they never use 90% of the setting for reasons. So what is Wizards getting wrong with all their setting guides? Well, it's time to look at the setting that stands uncorrupted, and remind them they still own the rights to it, and maybe admit it still exists while they reuse elements in other settings or even on the cover of the player's handbook. That's right, I'm talking about Jackandor. But considering I haven't read those books, we'll settle for Mystara. Wizards believes in a one-and-done release philosophy. You got one Ravenloft book after Strahd, and that one was almost a word-for-word conversion of the original with some extra things bolted on. They expected the DM's Guild to fill in all the blanks. And for Ravenloft, the blank was over 1,400 books, 13 of which, appropriately enough, are Adamantine bestsellers. But with Wizards' focus on cheaper-to-write digital books, there's no reason they can't keep up a constant release schedule. Yet the 5th edition's complete list of products was on par with 1st edition, and the TSR guys were making it up as they went along. So if they were to start expanding lore with new releases, how do they not screw this up? Well, first, don't threaten the people using their open licenses, but that's another video there. So let's begin with quality. You cannot deny that Mystara's list of authors was a who's who of fantasy creators. Just look at the basic and expert lines. You had Gary Gygax, Zeb Cook, Tom Moldvay, Douglas Niles, Carl Sargent, The Hickmans, Jim Bambara, Phil Gallagher, Aaron Alston, and Graham Morris. You'll recognize many of these names from other legendary video games and RPGs. Now, I'm not expecting WotC to assemble a murderer's row of legendary game designers, but they could still look at their guild, find people who are making adventures that people are willing to buy, and hire them. Say Rimley Farr, Jeff Stevens, or M.T. Black, who have multiple bestsellers. Hire those guys to write regular releases and advertise based on their reputation for quality. Instead of releasing an anthology with no credits to any of the writers, where we don't know if the designer is somebody we love or a complete rookie with no experience at all, give us people we look forward to buying. There has been a well-earned complaint that Wizards writes books for players, but DMs have to fend for themselves. They want the players to buy the new books, as there are far more of them than Dungeon Masters. The problem with this is that DMs need those books more than the players do, because they're the ones having to splice the games together. Mystara solved this issue early in the Gazetteer series, by putting the player section apart from the DM section. Players got some new options and a general overview of a setting or new relevant rules. Then the larger section of the book gave all the new monsters, a full setting breakdown, and all the adventures in one spot. There were typically 2 books in one package, but considering Wizards has been doing a 3 books in a sleeve approach recently, they could easily return to that. Instead of 3 64-page books, include a 32-page player's guide that is accompanied by an almost 200-page guide to the setting, with the monsters and maybe an adventure. Players still won't buy it, but they can borrow their guide from the DM, who is tasked with purchasing all the books. Quick, what's your favorite high-level official 5th edition adventure? It's a real short list, so take your time. Not like you have a lot to choose from. I'll save you the effort so you don't strain yourself remembering what adventures even got to 20th level. You have the disappointing end to the Vecna book, the end of the Mad Mage adventures, and there's a small cave and a compilation where you have to hunt down a single fairy. That's about it. All of them are set in a dungeon of some sort, facing the pinnacle of adventurers. Now look at Mystara's 5 highest level mortal modules. You've got the Greek Odyssey, so that's cheating. Then run your kingdom while a deity tries to kill you. Make sure the original owners of the planet stay imprisoned. Go plane hopping to recover your stolen city. Or bring peace to the 2 most powerful empires on the planet. Notice a bit of the difficulty scale increase? Mystara's Beckme system made a wonderful bit of adventure design, where as you increased in level, so did the scale of the campaign. Low-level adventures were dungeon crawls. Then you got to travel around on the surface, and the rules you played with expanded. Domain level play followed that, and then you were off on multiverse adventures. The universe expanded every few levels as to not overwhelm players with rules they didn't need yet. It was an iconic system, one that still gets used today, and there's a reason for that. But we still keep going back to 5th edition's DM issues. WOTC has said they have problems getting new DMs to take up the screen. And again, that's because they make it difficult for them. It doesn't help that rules like the challenge system make creating balanced encounters more like eyeballing it. Adventures like Heroes of the Borderlands give players everything they need in one place, and then the designers do things like splitting up all the rules for NPCs across 3 different pages or sets of cards. Now look how they did it with Mystara, with 3 famously written beginning modules that were designed with DMs in mind. Keep on the Borderland explained everything to the Dungeon Master as they came across it, and it was more like a war game talking to a new player. Lost City was like a module with training wheels, taking the Dungeon Master through each section step by step, and holding their hand less with each time. At the end, they give you a map of the city and tell you, now you know what to do. Finish it. King's Festival provided the DM with everything they needed on the page when it came up. It was written by a writer who understood the problems DMs faced, because it was obvious that he was a DM at one point. Mystara's world building is second to none, which is more than what can be said about the Remembered Realms. Somebody tell me the difference between the cultures in Waterdeep and Baldur's Gate. Now, can somebody differentiate the cultures between Darrican and Minrathad? I know they're both economic powerhouses, but they have unique mindsets and governments on how to deal with that. Mystara, unlike every other major D&D setting, built its world one nation at a time. Granted, that meant a complete Mystara book would have been well over 1,200 pages.
Don't give me hope.
However, the process of introducing a culture one at a time meant they could concentrate on each one rather than a few paragraphs before skipping to the next. The 3rd edition of Forgotten Realms learned this lesson, but it also introduced some of the bloat that plagued that era. If you're going with a digital format, however, that's not a problem anymore. Wizards loves its iconic characters, and it's fun to see people you know doing heroic things. Just look at the cover of the new Player's Handbook with Strongheart, Mercion, and Elkhart doing those heroic things, even if they cover up Strongheart's face for some reason. Be honest, this book could not withstand the power of that man's mustache. The stash that added +2 to Charisma and +4 armor class with a permanent protection from evil emanating from it. But a common complaint is Wizards, especially in the Realms, locks onto the biggest names and won't let them go, even hundreds of years after their supposed lifespan was over. Then the adventures can turn into celebrity cameos. DM NPCs are considered a bad thing, and putting them as major characters in modules can overshadow the players. Fortunately, Mystara has dealt with this perfectly in the past. We do have our iconics, we just don't put them in every adventure. Even arguably our most famous, with Bargle the Infamous, doesn't even appear in the adventure set in Fort Doom. The most prolific character, at least in terms of appearances, is without question Prince Haldimar. He's not in any adventures. He's there to serve as an exposition device that leaves journals that players read from to learn of the new areas. When Strongheart and his epic stash did appear in adventure, you actually played him. Similar to Die Vecna Die with the Council of Eight, only without the plot-mandated TPK. Archduke Stefan, one of the most famous rulers in Mystara, appears once in an adventure where he's not just handing out rewards at the end. Skarda's mirror has the party fight alongside him against the bad guys. But it's more of a reward because you've actually saved him at this point. Even the book that has all the famous NPCs with Red Arrow, Black Shield keeps them on the fringes because you're diplomats meeting the various heads of state. Emperor Thincall isn't dropping what he's doing to go on a quest to kill some Nosferatu because you asked him nicely. Stick with the Mystara way, and don't have your characters turn into sidekicks for established overpowered NPCs, even if they were on the cover of the last video game. The known world loved to push the rules of the game by adding optional and experimental rules with each gazetteer. Karamikos added the skill system, Yalarum had rules for storytelling, Glantry gave us new versions of magic, Irendi had naval combat, Alfheim expanded the elf class, and so on for 14 books, plus one box set. Wizards likes to test new rules with the Unearthed Arcana, and if they pass muster, they include them in a future book. If they don't pass, they will only occasionally get included into a future book. Usually these rules are compiled and stuffed into a single release, which gives us Tasha's and all the optional rules that have been banned from many a table. However, releasing the specialized rules in each gazetteer worked. You didn't have to include the Dwarven Cleric from Rockholm or the Shamani from Etrugan, but the Cleric was well written and became a staple of many tables. The Shamani was badly written and ignored, and mostly unplayable. You want players to buy more source books? Insert special rules that appeal to them in that book. Get players invested in the adventures with the options available and they'll jump on it. Kitchen sinks have their place, that being the kitchen. Nobody ever wants a living room sink. It would be very much out of place and also ruin the carpet. Every piece of art for 5th edition manages to include 10% of the monster manual, and not in an epic throwdown kind of adventure, more of a party or local soiree. That's one of the more common complaints that many people grumble about, as they're used to the epic art of old. They've got the 4 horsemen on their back, and that's a hard habit to kick. Mystara quickly established that if you wanted diversity in the setting, that was the player's job. Every nation has a particular architecture, culture, and population. You rarely find cities with a variety of races living in them. Even Darrican, the largest nation, was mostly human because the demi-humans preferred their own lands. The highly diversities had a reason to have such a varied population. Alfheim Town was the only place where the other races were welcome in Elfland. Thyatis City had its love of the exotic, even if you were going to be put on display like a trophy to be fawned over. This puts the party as the center of attention. They stand out as foreign and exotic wherever they go. Elves are rare in the northern reaches, but dwarves are welcomed or tolerated. Hin are respected in Yalarum, even if the locals tend to treat them as children. And unless you're a human or an elf, don't go to Glantry. Because of Mystara's love of expansive geographic lore in its various nations, it instantly creates identifiable places that the players can understand. It helps that most of the setting has real-world parallels viewed through a fantastical lens. This makes it simple for the DMs to recognize a setting and build adventures based on the cultures and legends of each one. It doesn't hurt that Mystara lacks a real bad guy nation in the known world. Every country is presented favorably in their book from their point of view. A new DM looking at Karamikos can find resources to inspire their adventures by looking at Byzantine-occupied Serbia. Well, if you wanted to adventure in Mongolia-inspired Ethengar, you'll need to learn how to ride a horse. There are pure fantasy nations, but they're reminders that it's still a D&D setting and not a real-world mishmash. I'm not saying turn the worlds into fantasy Europe, even though we don't do that with only 1/3 of the lands falling into that category, and some of those being Eastern Europe. Another third is based on nations found on other continents, and the remaining are creations of the writers with no Earth equivalents. You write what you know, and the players will recognize their legends and folklore and jump right in. Mystara does take the racial differences from the various creatures and nations and extends them even further by isolating available classes to specific people. If you want to play a Shadow Elf Shaman, you have to be a Shadow Elf, it's in the name. Makes sense, it gives them a cultural tie to their particular religion. Radiance magic is found exclusively in Glantry. Runes cannot be learned outside the northern reaches. If you want to be a tree keeper, your elf had best come from Alfheim. Now extend this to other settings. In the latest book, they introduced the Banneret subclass, which was originally the Purple Dragon Knights of Cormyr. Ignoring the kerfuffle from the playtest, the lore was perfect. If you wanted to be a member of that group, you had to be from Cormyr. Then the person playing one could explain to the rest of the party the lore, culture, and trappings of his exclusive class. Restrictions spawn creativity. If you want to play one of these subclasses, you have to follow the prerequisites. Now, how does your character stand out from the other Purple Dragon Knights? If you have a backstory that allows for an unusual option to be allowed to join such a group, that means you have to justify it. If you want to play a Knight of Solamnia, you have to follow the rules. This can create conflict in the party, which makes for better stories. And speaking as a DM, restricting who can play what can solve so many headaches later in the campaign when their options impact your storyline. Is Wizards ever going to adopt any of these suggestions? Probably about the same time they elect me as Pope. The Mystara paradox is a thing, which is an observation that was made during the decade of everyone sitting around waiting for them to keep their promise to open up all the settings for the guild. Before Wizards can address the supposed problems with our setting, they first have to admit it exists. They would rather ignore the second largest game world by number of books released than admit that the people that others claim would be offended actually love it. And yes, Mystara still has the largest number of books outside the Forgotten Realms, even though our last book was printed 30 years ago. It must be doing something right, or else we wouldn't be talking about it, and they wouldn't be borging it into the new edition despite refusing to even say its name now. WOTC's track record of late has been a bit spotty, to put it mildly. The Vecna book was poorly received, even after I gave them the plot a full 2 years earlier. Sales of the 5th edition have been poor if reports are to be believed, and the first 5th edition anthology with the dragons included, 30 pages of past art that was clearly filler? And you can still get the super duper special editions of that one from local stores, months after it was released. They've reintroduced 8 of the 10 core settings, if you include the Dark Sun Unearthed Arcana. And God help Athas players with what they're going to do to that one. The only 2 that remain are Birthright, which is hard to run because of the time jumps, and Mystara, the one that sold gangbusters because it knew what the fans wanted, and more importantly, they knew how to deliver it. So Wizards, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And it doesn't count as stealing if you already own it.